Now we're going to move on to our next speaker, who is Rebecca Self. She is the Director of Sustainable Finance at South Pole. In this role, Rebecca is responsible for the consultancy services offered to financial institutions globally, which combine climate science-led data and business integration advice. Good morning, Rebecca, and welcome to the Wall Street Green Summit again this year.
Thank you, and delighted to be here.
Good. Glad you could join us this morning. And there are several topics that we know we want to discuss with you today, all focused on financial institution perspectives. And the first one is net zero carbon. Let's expand on that idea and how it's going to apply to financial institutions.
Absolutely. And to start with, I'll give some small definitions and then get into exactly what net zero means, because we see many commitments, ambitions, and this term being used over and over. So starting with some definitions. So the analogy I'll use is the bathtub, which I've used before. So if you imagine carbon emissions in a bathtub, there are two ways to really address that and keep those emissions level. The first is to turn down the tap, i.e. reduce emissions. The second is to take out the plug, i.e. remove emissions. And net zero is about keeping that bathtub level by using both those two mechanisms. And you then quickly get into the definition of carbon emissions and what's really meant by carbon emissions. And based on the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which has been around for quite some time, decades, and it's really the basis that's used by scientists, by business, and by the governments, there are three scopes of emissions. And I'll take an example. I'll use a car manufacturer. So scope one would be emissions associated with actually making the car. Scope two is the indirect emissions. So scope one being direct, scope two being indirect. So the energy used in the manufacture. And then scope three is what happens once that car is driven from the forecourt of the garage, and it's those onward emissions as and when a customer goes and drives the car away. And these scopes are important because with net zero, certain scopes are relevant for certain institutions. So with those two definitions in mind, the bathtub and the scopes, what does this really mean for the financial industry? Well, there's a few different guidelines for looking at net zero with investment portfolios. And there are three main actions to complete. The first is to start measuring. And that means looking at the investment portfolio. So a financial institution's scope three is their value chain, it's their onward emissions, and measuring the companies which are lent and invested to. And with those companies, a financial institution can take their share of the emissions of those companies. And typically they'll take the operational emissions. So the scope one and two of the companies that they lend and invest to. And as Sean mentioned earlier, in the EU, and I'm based in the Netherlands, originally from the UK, but in the EU, there's some legislation which means over time, scope three will also be included in many of these calculations for financial institutions too. But today, largely it's measuring the scope three of an investment portfolio. So those onward emissions via lending, via investing, taking the share of the operational emissions of the companies which are lent and invested to. So first thing, measure. The second thing is then to start turning down the taps. So really reducing those emissions by setting KPIs, by divesting perhaps in some cases, by shifting the portfolio and decarbonising in line with scientific scenarios with the Paris Agreement. And then finally, there will be some emissions in the context of net zero that simply cannot be abated. They cannot be reduced, they will remain. And for those which cannot be abated, they can be removed. And that's principally using carbon offsets. So for example, it could be planting trees, technology, carbon capture and storage. So pulling the plug and removing those emissions. So that's firstly some information about net zero. Then to talk a bit about some ideas. And net zero is just one piece of the environmental analysis which financial institutions are looking at now. But there are much broader ideas looking at the environment, social and governance aspects for financial institutions and integrating these into decisions. And with ESG, it's much more systemic. So there's lots of incremental changes happening. But now there are lots more questions around what needs to happen at a system level to drive change, to drive innovation. And there's new ways we can think about doing that. New ways of thinking about economics, about politics, about society, about the financial industry itself. So just to mention three, the first is looking at many banks' balance sheets and looking at investors. There's a large portion of economic activity, which is the financial sector, lending and investing to the financial sector. And so, in my opinion, there needs to be a much stronger connection to the real economy, as Sean was discussing earlier, having those KPIs, really putting that money and investing into green projects and into the green economy. And that may be at quite a local level often. Just one example to mention here in the Netherlands, tomorrow is Koningsdag. So this is the King's Day, it's a public holiday, everyone wears orange, but it's also a day when many people, including individuals, will buy and sell things on the street. Normal licensing laws are somewhat relaxed. And I think having this more local perspective is something that we'll certainly see increase. And increasingly also supermarkets have an option where you can select to buy local or buy from somewhere nearby. So that's something that we'll start to see more real economy activity, and then looking at more localization. And then finally, another thought is more accountability with regard to ESG. And one example there to mention, over the past week with many of the football clubs in Europe, so 6 of the largest UK football clubs, as well as Italian and Spanish football clubs, they had a Super League that was proposed. And this Super League was funded by a large US bank. And it was incredibly inspiring for me to see the amount of activity of fans on social media protesting and really influencing change with regard to this new initiative, which was later dropped. And reflecting on it, I think one of the reasons that happened was simply looking at different stakeholders. So not purely looking at decision making via the shareholders and through the financial perspective, but also looking at financial decision making via shareholders, communities, and the end customers, and the people that work at these organizations, and in this case, the fans. So I think having this accountability, and that depends on us and on working collectively at times, to hold people really to account and set those KPIs to take into account those perspectives. I think that's something that we really need to see over the coming months and years.
Rebecca, that's a really important focus that you've mentioned related to accountability, because of course, here in the US as well, large banks often will make these very long-term commitments to accountability issues like net zero, but they really don't have any underlying long-range plan that they've started or put in place related to how they're going to get there. And so what a lot of investors are saying is, well, we need more transparency. We need more accountability related to how they measure and how they actually come up with the data that says they're going to achieve these goals. So What is the role of climate data in all of that and related to that measurement process?
Yeah, and data does play a key role here, as does basis of preparation, as you say, that transparency. We could speak for years. You know, if I look at accounting standards, and I'm a chartered accountant, international accounting standards, it's decades we've been talking about it, and they're still not really that consistent globally. There's still differences. So with regard to data, yes, it underpins net zero. It underpins many of these perspectives, but I don't think we have time to wait in order for everything to be perfect, to be standardized, to be comparable, nor is that really realistic. There's always going to be some variability depending on the business model, the institution itself, its geographic footprint. So then with data, it becomes about setting out those scopes, which I mentioned earlier. So a very clear basis of preparation and being transparent and about saying, this is the way we've measured it today. This is where we've started. This is where we're heading towards. This is what we're going to do next in the near term. And along the way, there will be things that evolve, things that change, things which are learnt. And so also as being adult and grown up enough, both as institutions, but also users of the information, to learn as we go, because it will evolve. This data will evolve as we go along.
Okay. Now, what you mentioned system level focus. What ideas for system level innovation and change are you looking at now at South Pole? And what other opportunities are there out there to incorporate a more system level focus and measurement processes related to climate?
Yeah, and as I mentioned, there are these system level changes, systemic changes which are needed. So at South Pole, we focus a lot on the environment and carbon emissions, but that's not exclusive. We also look at other areas such as water, soil, biodiversity. One of the system level changes that I've been looking at is donut economics. So the model of how we can live within certain parameters, not solely looking at climate, but many other social and environmental issues. So that's one example. The circular economy is another, which is mentioned in the opening words. So moving to less waste, how we can have better ways of producing and eliminating that waste, both in processes, but also at the end of life of products as well, so they can be reused. I think one other final point to mention is about that accountability. That's us as individuals in our spending and day-to-day lives, sort of trying to do the right things. I try myself, I'm not always perfect, but it's also operating, you know, somewhat more collectively from time to time. There are many different initiatives that we can join, and so NGOs to get involved in, volunteering opportunities to get involved in too.
Yes, I think it's especially important for our participants today and our listeners to understand that system level change is really talking about not just being an investor in the right types of programs or just doing the volunteer work. It's about integrating this whole kind of process into your entire lifestyle, your economic activity, as well as your focus within your community and what you can do there. I know, for example, here where I live in Beacon, New York, I've been on the board of a sustainable farming group, and I also participate in other organizations that are focused, excuse me, specifically on environmental impact. So what is upcoming in your work at South Pole that our listeners could tune into and stay in touch with related to system level change?
We have a number of webinars which are available on southpole.com. So that's one place to take a look, as well as many different blogs and information. One of the areas that I'll be focusing on next is biodiversity and looking at some of the impacts there, and also taking some of the learnings that we have from carbon to try and learn from the experience of implementing these disclosures and carry that across to other sorts of topics like biodiversity or like social topics. We don't have to start everyone completely from scratch. we can take the learnings as we go through these various different issues and different things that we're looking at. So it's really trying to take the learning and look at the world, the planet as an ecosystem, not everything in its individual silo.
And Rebecca, what is the scope of that work at South Pole? Are you doing it with corporations, with governments, with institutional investors, family offices? How are you exploring those issues with the clients that you have or the people you work with at South Pole?
Yeah, all those areas. So just to mention the three key areas from South Pole. One I mentioned is carbon offsets. So that's sourcing projects on the ground, often in the developing world, which remove or absorb carbon, packaging those up, certifying, verifying them, ensuring they meet standards, and then matching to corporate demand, or available for individuals. So that's one example. Another is platforms. So project managing platforms that bring together policymakers, academics, other individuals and companies who are interested in certain topics. For example, there's a coalition that focuses on biodiversity called CPIC, CPIC. So that's another example. We also have funds which deliver an impact. So there will be carbon emissions removed or landscape reforested, just to give an example. And then finally, consulting work, which would be with investors, with banks, corporates of all shapes and sizes, to help them along their journey.
And are this is a global community that you're working within? It's not limited to companies or institutions in the EU or the US or some combination. It's around the world as well? It's
global. So we have close to 20 offices globally. Ironically, I think the only continent we're not part of is the South Pole, which is somewhat ironic with the name. But yes, a global company and many colleagues, hundreds of colleagues all around the world. So I work with institutions, financial institutions of all shapes and sizes. And I've been really encouraged actually over the last probably 5 to 6 months. It's been a huge amount of momentum coming from North America. So that's really positive and really great to see.
Terrific. Okay, well, let me just pose this one question for you, Rebecca. It's come in from our audience, which is, how do you measure the impact of individual actions? I'm assuming that the person who posted that question is interested in engaging in whatever way they can around these types of activities for system level change. Just in the next 30 seconds or so, can you give them a couple of ideas?
One example, take a look at Good Life Goals, and this takes the UN Sustainable Development Goals and has them for individuals. So that's a really great place to start, and I've been trying to tick them off myself.
What's the name again of that organization?
It's called the Good Life Goals.
Good Life Goals. Okay,
yeah.
Great. Well, Rebecca, thank you very much for your time today. We really appreciate you and South Pole participating once again in the Wall Street Green Summit, and we look forward to hearing from you again.
Thank you. And for anyone who's has a Dutch background or maybe is based in the Netherlands, I just wanted to say a final happy Orange Day for tomorrow. I'll leave you there.
Okay, thanks very much.